I'm a big believer in empowering people to make their own decisions. And so today we're talking about cables and interconnects from the perspective of empowerment. And the path to such empowerment comes in two forms: knowledge and choice. Let's start with knowledge, but we're going to keep it simple. This is all simple chemistry and physics we're going to talk about. There's no voodoo or witchcraft here. When it comes to metals used to carry signals from your DAC to your amp, or from your amp to your speakers, the very best conductor of all metals known to man is silver. And the reason for that is the chemistry bit of this video. The atomic structure of silver is such that each individual silver atom has just one electron floating around in its outer shell. And because there's only one electron floating around in the outer shell of a silver atom, that electron is very easy to move. And if we now think about the signal traveling from our DAC to our amp, or from our amp to our speakers, those signals are all about the flow of electrons moving from one device and into another. And so because the electrons in silver atoms are so easy to move, silver conductors make it much easier for, say, a DAC to shunt the signal, to shunt the electrons down through a silver wire and into our amp at the other end. That is all a little bit oversimplified, but it's the gist of it. And so, in an ideal world, every conductor we ever use would be silver. All of the wiring in the voice coils of speakers, the wires from the voice coils or from the speaker mechanism back to the binding post on the back of the speaker cables that then run from the back of the speaker into your amplifier, the wiring inside the amplifier, and even the traces embedded within the circuit boards. Everything like that would be made of silver. But as you probably already know, they're not. And the reasons for that are many. Firstly, silver corrodes quite easily when exposed to air. That can make it look a little bit crappy, but it also reduces its conductivity a little bit. The corroded layer of silver sulfide on the outside of a silver object is technically still conductive, but to a lesser degree than pure silver, and that can influence the travel of the signal down that conductor. Interestingly, copper, as it corrodes, actually stops working altogether as a conductor, whereas silver does still conduct electricity, just to a lesser degree. And so corrosion isn't the main reason that silver is not the most common conductor in audio, but it is a part of it. There are likely two other key reasons that silver is not as commonly used as copper, and one of them is the cost. Silver is considered a precious metal, it's a rarer metal, and so it's much more expensive than copper. To contextualize that, in September of 2025, as I'm recording this, the cost of copper is around about $11 per kilogram. At exactly the same time, the cost of silver is around about $1,400 per kilogram. Even if maths isn't your thing, that's probably already a fairly obvious motivator for using copper instead of silver for conductors. But there's also the issue of malleability. That's a fancy word for how easily a metal can be worked, can be bent, can be pressed, can be drawn into wires. And on one hand, the fact that silver is very malleable is excellent for drawing it into wires to be used in conductors. But that benefit also comes with a cost, which is that silver is very easily deformed by any kind of mechanical pressure and can more easily break after many bends back and forth. And so if we think about it in the context of conductors or wires or cables, a silver wire that is bent over and over again back and forth, maybe by connecting and disconnecting regularly or being moved around regularly, that silver wire is more likely to break sooner than a copper wire. And so on the surface, silver wires should be the best possible choice for audio, so long as price is no object, and you're not going to be putting that wire under regular mechanical stress, plugging and unplugging, bending it regularly, snagging it on things, pulling on it, that sort of thing. And so we should all go out and buy silver wires, shouldn't we? Maybe not quite. Whilst you might want to add some silver interconnects or silver speaker cables to your system, there are also some reasons you might not want to. Because copper conductors are far more commonly used than silver, most of the music that you're listening to will have been mixed, mastered, recorded, all using copper wires. That also means it's been designed to listen to on systems using copper wires. As such, any sonic differences created by the use of silver wiring could make the music less enjoyable. It's a big could, but it's something to think about. And that's a lovely segue to talking about this wire. This is a set of custom XLR interconnect cables made for me and sent to me by AST Conductors. And so yes, they sent me these cables for review, but they have no influence over what I'm going to say in this review. AST is a brand that is focused entirely on the production of the silver wire used inside cables like this, or used inside the actual electronic devices, whether it's the voice coil on a speaker or the individual wires used inside an electronic device. And so they can supply wires to you for use in XLR cables, RCA cables, speaker cables, or any other use you can really think of. And when I say that these are custom cables, I don't mean that there's anything fancy going on in there. I just mean that they've made them to the length that I asked for, and they've put XLR cables on the end at my request. Remember, I said before there is no voodoo or witchcraft in this video. AST just wanted me to hear their pure silver conductors in action and see how they compared to other interconnects that I might have. And before I discuss exactly how the AST wires compared to my aftermarket high-end premium interconnects, let's talk quickly about what this could all mean for you. On the AST website, you can order the plain wire to make up cables for yourself or any other kind of DIY use for that wire that you might have. And you can order the wire with or without sheathing, with or without insulation. It's up to you. Or, as you can gather from what I've got here, you could also order the wires and ask AST to send them to you after they fit the RCA or XLR plugs, or in the future I believe speaker connections as well. And I'll go through the ordering process at the very end because it is a little bit fiddly. For now though, let's just understand the pricing. A set of 1 meter XLR leads like the set that I have here would cost you €460 before shipping. You might be shocked to hear that price when you think about the cost of regular copper RCA cables from your local Hifi store, but remember that the price of silver per kilogram is about 127 times the price of copper. Working with that factor of price magnification based purely on the cost per kilogram of copper and silver, that means that the XLR cables that you'd spend €460 on from AST for the pure silver cables would be the equivalent of spending $3.62 for the same quality of copper cables. Now clearly that's not an accurate way to calculate the value of the cables or the quality of the cables, and I haven't factored in things like the cost of the sheathing, the cost of having the XLR plugs attached, and the cost of the XLR plugs themselves, but hopefully it illustrates the point. These are not expensive in the scheme of the cost of the parts compared to what you're then getting. Their cost isn't being inflated by any kind of special marketing or proprietary technologies. It's just purely a case of silver costing a whole lot more than copper. And so that begs the question, do they then sound better based purely on the materials being used inside? Because there is no fancy stuff being done in the design. They've been braided together in a simple 3-way braid, and they've had XLR cables attached to the end. But beyond that, they're just pure silver wires. And so I worked my way through 3 other premium XLR cables that I have here to see how the AST conductors compared to some aftermarket, more kind of professionally designed XLR cables. And the first one I grabbed were the Curious XLR cables. I love these for their suppleness and for their smooth, layered and detailed sound qualities. You'll pay about $700 for 1 meter XLR leads from Curious cables, so they're significantly more expensive than the AST conductors. And I'm calling them AST conductors still because technically they're not some fancy wiring design or cable design. They're just conductors, in other words strands of wire, with plugs attached. But I might start calling them AST XLR cables just so we're really clear, but keep in mind they are just 3 wires braided together to keep them together and then plugs attached to the ends. As I listened to the Curious XLR cables and the AST XLR cables, what I noticed first was that the AST cables were delivering a little bit more detail or resolution than the Curious cables. And that's probably thanks to the conductivity of the silver wires. The differences were subtle, but they were noticeable. Further listening showed that the Curious cables did focus the center image a little bit better than the AST cables, and it also the Curious cables provided a little bit more depth in the soundstage too. In contrast, the AST cables delivered a slightly flatter and wider soundstage experience. I'd also say that there was maybe just the tiniest dash of warmth or smoothness in the Curious cables, but that was a very tiny shift. And as I switched back and forth between the Curious cables and the AST cables, I felt like I slightly preferred the Curious cables sound, but it was entirely a preferential thing. The AST cables were clearly stronger in resolution by maybe 1 to 2%, and so others will definitely prefer the AST cables, both for their price tag, but also their sense of technical resolution. Or when I say technical resolution, I mean the technicalities, and therefore the resolution. And by the way, if you're thinking about buying a set of XLRs to maybe connect up a brand new streamer, or DAC, or preamp, then you should check out the sponsor of this video too. Linsol specialise in head-fi and portable audio, but they carry some fantastic hi-fi components too. For example, you might be in the market for a new DAC. Linsol carry options like the Musician brand of R2R DACs, the insanely good new Gustard X30 and R30 DACs, as well as brands like Shanling, Topping, and SMSL. They have the premium level gear, as well as the more budget and entry level gear, and everything in between, so the choice is yours. They also carry source devices too, like streamers, CD players, and CD transports. And so if you need an upgrade in your source chain, visit Linsol using the link in the description below and support them like they're supporting this channel. And now, let's see if we can work out which interconnects you're going to want to choose to connect up your new audio toys. Next up were the Supra Sword XLR cables. These are about $660 a pair after conversion from 563 euros per pair. Once again, that makes them significantly more expensive than the AST cables. And once again, the AST cables delivered noticeably greater resolution. And I found with these tests that the differences in resolution between these cables became more or less evident depending on the specific tracks that I was using, but the difference was always in favour of the AST cables, and it was also never massive, but it was always noticeable. And that does make sense. By using more conductive wire or more conductive metals within that wire, there is less resistance to the signal, and I mean that in a very non-technical way. There is less resistance to the signal passing through. And that means that the very finest details, the very, very smallest sounds can get through that cable undamaged or unhindered. Knowing that the Supra cables are very similar to the Curious XLR cables, I was unsurprised to hear that once again, the Supra cables in this case had slightly better layering and depth when compared to the AST cables. However, in this case, I would say that the differences were smaller. The Curious cables produced more depth and more layering compared to the Supra cables, and the Supra cables produce a little bit more depth and layering than the AST cables, but the difference was much closer here. And at this point, we should briefly touch on this concept of staging. There's actually a lot going on inside wires. Unless it's a single, thick, solid wire carrying the signal, what you're really hearing in many of the cables that we use in audio is the same signal travelling at the same time along hundreds of little tiny wires. If those little individual wires aren't all perfectly arranged, and realistically when it comes to this stuff there is no such thing as perfect, but if they're not optimally arranged, let's say, every time those signals pass next to one another in those cables or in those individual wires, they're interacting with one another. And that's all due to concepts known as inductance and capacitance, and it happens in every cable of every design. And then, if it is a single solid wire, as it is with these guys, each of the three strands, as I understand it, is a single 0.95mm wire. In this kind of wire, there's a different set of issues, where different frequencies of the signal will travel at different depths within the wire and travel at slightly different speeds too. On top of that, everything that I've just said is also frequency dependent. So what's happening in the bass frequencies is going to be different to what's happening in the treble frequencies and all the way in between. As I said before, what happens inside wires and cables is way more complex than most people realise. And I suspect that the AST cables are in no way optimized from a sound staging and what I'm going to call signal coherency point of view. When you look at more premium and custom designed cables, when I say custom designed, where it's been made specifically for audio purposes and specifically for a specific audio purpose, like a dedicated XLR cable might be different from a dedicated RCA cable because the signal is traveling differently and interacting differently in a 2-core RCA cable compared to a 3-core XLR cable. When you're buying brands like Curious, Supra, I'm going to talk about Ricable in a second, and every other well-designed cable on the market, they have thought about things like the cable geometry or how the internal wires have been laid out together to deal with things like inductance and capacitance as best they can. And so when it comes to the AST cables here, I don't think they've been optimized for that stuff. It's just a simple 3-way braid. And that's likely what's preventing these from getting maximum possible performance in things like staging and imaging, but we're also talking about subtleties of the sound at this point, and things that some of you aren't going to want to worry about or get too hung up about, and I totally get that. What was clear to me at this point though, was that the AST cables are incredible value for money when they're going toe-to-toe with much more expensive aftermarket cables at way less of a price. And I had one more example to try now, just to see how good the AST cables could really be. The Ricable Invictus reference XLR cables up the ante further still, with a US dollar price for a 1 meter pair of around about $1,012. That's converted from 862 euros for a 1 meter pair. I'll give you a moment to pick your jaw up off the floor. The Invictus XLR cable had the same benefits in soundstage depth and layering as the Curious and the Supra cords that came before, and I also felt like it helped to produce a denser vocal or solo instrumental image in the center of the soundstage when compared to the AST cables. That made the solos or the vocals more present and more lifelike within the central image. But beyond that, these two cables were very difficult to separate. I say very difficult, but not impossible. The Invictus cable was the first cable in this test that I would say was clearly superior to the AST cables. They matched the resolution of the AST cables, whereas the other two I felt lagged just a 1 or 2% behind the AST cables. But at the same time, the Invictus cables were also a little bit smoother on the top end. So all the detail was there, but it was also a touch smoother. And that's nice for the Ricables to get the win. But let's step back for a moment and think about what that actually means here. If you want a properly premium set of interconnects, but you don't want to spend $1,000 for a 1 meter pair, or obviously more if you're going longer, then you don't have to anymore. Sure, the AST cables don't look as pretty as some of the others, and they're not optimized for sound staging and imaging performance like some of the others. But they're far from bad in terms of sound staging and imaging, and I think overall they're pretty incredible value for money. As I said before, you can make them even cheaper if you just want to buy the wire and then solder on the plugs for yourself, which may also involve a bit of braiding work, but that can be quite therapeutic. Or of course, you can do what I did and get AST to add the plugs for you. In addition to that, my understanding is that AST are still continuing to improve their products. That means that you should soon be able to buy these with banana plugs or spades attached for speaker connections. But they also tell me that they're constantly improving the quality of their wire too. And so if you do think that you might like to order some of these, let me quickly tell you what to expect if you go through the ordering process, because it is a little bit tricky. Because an XLR cable like this one has 3 conductors, a 1 meter XLR lead will have 3 meters of wire in it. In other words, 3 lots of 1 meter wires. If you then think about the fact that XLR is a stereo pair, that means you need to order a total of 6 meters of wire for a 1 meter pair of XLR cables. If you're going for RCA cables instead, you can cut that down to just 2 meters per wire because RCA is a 2-core wire, not a 3-core like XLR. And so you'd order 6 meters of wire for a 1 meter XLR cable or 4 meters of wire for a 1 meter RCA cable. For speaker cables, AST recommend using 4 strands of wire per pole on your speaker. In other words, you'll have 4 strands going from the positive terminal of your amp to the positive terminal on the speaker, and 4 strands of wire going from the negative to the negative. And so that means if you were just doing 1 meter speaker cables, you're going to be ordering 8 meters for the left and 8 meters for the right, a total of 16 meters. And that means you're going to be talking 32 meters if you're doing 2 meter cables, or 48 meters of wire if you're doing 3 meter cables. So speaker cables are going to add up in a hurry. That said, they might still be cheaper than the equivalent competition. And then once you've worked out how much wire you need, you'll need to select to have it insulated in the PTFE insulation. That's going to protect it from wear and tear, corrosion, and of course short circuits. And you'll also likely want to add on the fabric sheathing over the top for further protection against abrasion and the like. It also might look better, but that could be personal choice. Further down the ordering form, you can then choose, as I said before, to have AST provide the XLR or RCA connections, and in the future, I believe, the speaker connections. And then you've got another choice for them to solder them on. In both cases, you're going to be buying 1 set of connectors for a stereo set of leads. So you'll just choose to buy 1 set of XLR connections if you're buying 1 pair of XLR cables. and then you can choose just one unit of having those plugs attached, which again covers a pair of cables entirely. Once that's done, AST will get them all made for you, send them out. There'll obviously be some shipping charges as well, and that's going to vary based on where you are. And then when you receive them, hopefully you'll be really impressed with the performance. I know I was, given the cost of these compared to the alternatives that I've gone through in this video. And so if this video has you all fired up to go out and buy some wire and make your own cables, or maybe get AST to make them for you, I'll put a link in the description down below. Or if instead this has made you start thinking about how much you might be willing to spend on XLR cables, or RCA cables, or speaker cables, the video I've pinned here at the end will help you think through that a bit further with a bit more information that I think will make things very clear. So watch that one next. But for now, a huge thanks to YouTube channel members, also to channel Patreon members, and of course to those of you who leave super thanks on videos like this one. And until next time, happy listening, be kind to each other, and I'll see you here again soon on Passion for Sound.